They said the house had been empty for decades, but when they broke the lock and stepped inside, the air wasn't dead. It was waiting. In the corner of the room, beneath a shroud of mold and silence, there were photographs that shouldn't have existed. A wedding portrait, faded beyond color, showing a man and a woman whose faces looked almost identical. The caption beneath it was written by hand, in trembling ink, "For love and blood are one." At first glance, it might have looked like any old rural marriage from the early 1900s, a small town couple, stiff, backed and pale, dressed in their Sunday best. But when the local historian matched the family records, the truth split the town in two. The groom wasn't just her husband, he was her nephew, and their bloodline was still alive. Stories like this don't survive in textbooks. They're whispered in attics, scribbled in private letters, burned before the eyes of strangers. But every so often, a record slips through the cracks, and it reveals a kind of American horror no one wants to remember. This isn't Europe's royal inbreeding or the dynasties of old. This is something far quieter, buried deep in the rural bones of a country that was still learning what civilized meant. It began in a place called Hickory Hollow, West Virginia, 1912. A town with fewer than 300 people, a place so isolated that the mountains around it felt like walls. No trains came through, no schools past the 8th grade, families married within families, not because they were monstrous, but because there was no one else. When you're born in a valley surrounded by the same faces, generation after generation, you start mistaking familiarity for destiny. The woman's name was Ada Bell. She was born in 1878, the eldest of 7. Her sister, Clara, was 12 years younger, a child Ada helped raise when their mother died. By the time Ada was 30, Clara had a boy of her own, a son named William. He grew up in Ada's house, sleeping in the same small room that once held her own childhood bed. She was the closest thing to a mother he knew. But when William turned 19, something shifted. The neighbors noticed it before the family did. The way his eyes lingered when she spoke, the quiet way he began to follow her down the dirt path toward the creek. Ada, by then, was in her 40s. Grief had hollowed her out after losing her husband to pneumonia. She wore black every day, as though she'd married mourning itself. But William saw something else in her, a kind of devotion that only comes from shared blood and years of wordless understanding. People told themselves it couldn't be what it looked like, that maybe she was just lonely, that maybe he was just kind. But when Ada became pregnant, there were no excuses left. The church turned its back. Clara, her own sister, William's mother, vanished from the county altogether. The baby, a girl named Louise, was born with striking features, one blue eye, one gray. The midwife refused to sign the birth record, calling it an abomination. Yet in that tiny valley, nothing was ever truly erased. Everyone knew, they just didn't speak. Historians found the first written mention of the scandal in a 1914 letter to the county clerk, describing the unnatural union between Mrs. Ada Bell H. and her nephew, William C. The letter asked that both be charged under the consanguinity statute. But the sheriff never served a warrant. No one wanted the outside world coming in. That's the thing about places like Hickory Hollow. Secrets don't die there, they ferment. They become part of the soil, part of the trees. And by the 1940s, that family's descendants were still living in the same cabin, under the same warped beams, still calling Ada's photograph grandmother. When researchers from Marshall University came through decades later, they found something uncanny in the records, a line of marriages so entangled that by the 4th generation, the family tree looped back on itself. Cousins became siblings in all but name. Birth certificates were rewritten. The same 6 surnames appeared again and again like a mantra the valley refused to forget. Some of the descendants had strange features, jaw deformities, crossed eyes, stunted growth. Medical journals call it recessive expression, but the locals used another word, curse. Yet the more you read their letters, the more disturbing it becomes, not because of what they did, but because of how they justified it. In one surviving page of Ada's journal, she wrote, "God made Adam and Eve from one body. What is marriage then but a return? It wasn't lust, not to her. It was a kind of twisted faith, an attempt to keep purity by keeping it all within." And that belief didn't end with her death. By 1956, the Bell family had become a myth in the region, ghost stories told to scare children away from wandering too far up the hollow. "Don't go past the third bend," they said. That's where the blue-eyed ones live. But every myth begins somewhere true. An old coal miner once told an interviewer that he'd seen them, pale, silent people with faces that looked too close to the same. They didn't speak much, he said, just watched, always watched. When he was asked what he thought they were guarding, he paused. Then he said, "Their own kind." You can trace their blood through birth certificates, census records, even DNA samples taken decades later, a single valley, looping inward on itself until identity becomes a mirror maze. It's not just history. It's biology gone blind. And when you look at that wedding photograph again, the one where husband and aunt stare at the camera with hollow eyes, you start to feel something deeper than disgust. You feel pity. Because this wasn't a story of monsters. It was a story of people so isolated, so starved for connection, that they turned inward until all they had left was themselves. The past doesn't always rot in the ground. Sometimes it breathes, through families like the Bells, through the faces of descendants who carry names they don't understand, and bloodlines that whisper through their bones. And if you go to Hickory Hollow today, the house is still there. Leaning silent, the front door is chained shut, but through the dust-caked window you can still see it, the portrait, two faces side by side, almost the same, watching you back. And in the bottom corner, barely visible beneath the grime, are those words again, "For love and blood are one." They say every curse starts with a choice. But when you trace the bloodline of Ada and William Bell, it doesn't feel like a choice at all. It feels like gravity, a pull so ancient, so quiet, that no one even realized they were falling until it was too late. By the 1960s, the Bell family was scattered across 3 counties, but their name carried a shadow. Schoolteachers in Clay and Nicholas counties remembered the children who came barefoot, pale and silent. Their paperwork was strange parents with birth years too close together, mothers who were also aunts, fathers who were technically cousins. When one social worker tried to untangle it, she described it as a family tree without branches. That phrase stuck with me because that's what happens when love refuses to reach outward. It curls inward like a vine strangling itself. In 1968, a journalist named Robert Kerr came to Hickory Hollow to write about Appalachian poverty. He wasn't looking for the Bells, but one night in a local bar, an old man pulled him aside and said, "If you want the real story, go up the mountain and ask about the wedding that never ended." Kerr followed the dirt road until his car couldn't go any further. He hiked the rest. When he reached the clearing, he saw what was left of the Bell homestead, a collapsing cabin, a sagging barn, and the faint outline of a family cemetery behind the trees. He wrote that the air smelled of mildew and copper, and that the silence felt alive. He knocked on the door. An old woman answered. She had a long braid of white hair and 2 different, colored eyes. She said her name was Louise, Ada's daughter, the child of nephew and aunt, the one they called the blue-eyed. Kerr described her as calm, even polite, but guarded. She told him she lived there with her sons, though he never saw them. When he asked about her parents, she smiled and said they were closer than most. Later that night, when he drove back down the mountain, he stopped at a gas station. The attendant asked where he'd been. When Kerr said the Old Bell place, the man dropped the hose and stepped back. He told Kerr, "You don't go there at night. They don't take kindly to outsiders." A week later, Kerr's notes were mailed to his editor in Charleston. But the article was never printed. The envelope came with a short letter, handwritten, unsigned. "You shouldn't have gone up there. Some families were meant to stay forgotten." The records go silent after that. But every generation leaves a trace. In 1982, a genealogist researching hereditary illnesses came across the Bell name again, this time in medical reports. A cluster of related individuals in West Virginia showing a rare congenital deformity, fused fingers, cleft palate, and cognitive delay. All connected to one bloodline. The inbreeding had gone on so long that genetic identity had started to blur. One doctor wrote, "They are the living ghosts of a closed system." But that's not what disturbs me most. What disturbs me are the photographs. There are a few, taken in the 70s and 80s, before the last of them left the hollow. Children standing in front of that same leaning house. Blank stares, pale eyes. One photo shows a teenage boy, his head tilted slightly, smiling just a little too wide. Behind him, through the cracked window, you can see a framed image still hanging on the wall. It's Ada and William's portrait. The same one, still watching, when local police eventually condemned the house in the late 1990s. They reported finding human remains in the cemetery out back, unmarked graves, some shallow, some child-sized. DNA analysis linked them all to one family group. No outsiders, no intermarriage. For over 80 years, the blood never left that soil. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, protecting the secret? Or would you have burned it all down and walked away? Because that's the real horror here. Not the deformities, not the sin. The horror is in the silence, in the way no one came for them, in the way a valley turned its back and called it privacy. They weren't hidden by force, they were hidden by neglect. The more I read, the more I realized the Bell family wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. Throughout rural America in the 20th century, isolation created worlds, inside worlds, families that never left their land, children who never saw a town, entire generations folded in on themselves. Some out of faith, some out of shame, some because they truly believed that keeping their blood pure meant keeping it sacred. There's a reason you don't see many photographs from places like Hickory Hollow. Cameras were expensive, yes, but more than that, people didn't want to be remembered. A picture was a kind of confession, proof that you existed when you weren't supposed to. Some say that when Ada Bell died, her daughter Louise refused to bury her. That she kept her mother's body in the house for 3 days, dressed her in the same wedding gown from that portrait, and whispered prayers over her until the candlelight went out. By the time they found her, the body was gone. Some say Louise buried her herself. Others claim she didn't bury her at all, that she sealed her in the walls, and in that valley, stories like that don't fade. They become part of the landscape, warnings told by the wind, echoes carried down the creek. The bells are gone now, but sometimes hikers report hearing footsteps in the hollow long after dark, a woman's voice humming an old hymn, or the faint flicker of light in the window of a house that shouldn't still be standing. And maybe it's just the wind, maybe it's memory, but when you look into that photograph, into those eyes that seem to recognize you, you realize something. They didn't just marry each other, they bound themselves to time itself. And the past doesn't forget its own. When the state finally leveled the Bell property in 2003, no one wanted to be the one to swing the hammer. The demolition crew reported that the air around the place felt heavier, as if the woods themselves were listening. One man swore he heard children laughing somewhere deep in the trees, but when he followed the sound, there was only wind and the distant creak of rusted hinges. The house came down slowly, boards splintered like bones. And beneath the floorboards, they found something that shouldn't have survived time, a tin box, wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax. Inside were scraps of paper, brittle as moth wings. They were letters. Dozens of them, some signed by Ada, others by Louise. The words were faint, but the meaning was clear enough. The letters were addressed not to family, not to friends, but to God. Ada's earliest letters begged for forgiveness. She wrote of dreams filled with fire and rivers of blood, of hearing her dead husband's voice whisper from the corners of the room. But as the years went on, the tone changed, the guilt softened, the prayers turned into declarations. She began to write as though she had been chosen, as though her union with her nephew was not a sin, but a sign. One line burned itself into my mind: if our blood is one, then our souls are one. Let no man tear apart what heaven has joined. The last of Ada's letters was written in 1919. The ink had bled almost completely away, but under light, one phrase could still be read. She has my eyes now. The mark will carry. She, we can assume, meant Louise, her daughter, the child born from that forbidden blood. The one whose mismatched eyes would become the family's haunting symbol for generations. Louise's own letters were darker. Her handwriting was jagged, uneven, as if she'd written them in a shaking hand. In one, she wrote about dreams of many mouths speaking through one voice. In another, she confessed she no longer knew which memories were hers and which belonged to her mother. She wrote, "When I speak, I feel her tongue move too. When I sleep, I dream her dreams." Whether it was madness or heredity, no one can say. But those letters make it hard to shake the feeling that the Bell bloodline didn't just mix bodies, it mixed selves. As though identity had dissolved in that narrow valley until the past and present could no longer tell each other apart. One of the workers took a photograph of the box before it was removed, and though most of the writing is illegible now, you can still see the faint smudge of a fingerprint pressed into the wax. It's small. Likely a woman's. There's a certain irony in what happened next. The Bell remains, those bones dug up from the family cemetery, were taken to a state lab for cataloging. But somewhere between storage and transport, they were misplaced. Officially, the record says they were misfiled. Unofficially, no one ever saw them again. Some think that was mercy, that letting the dead rest was better than naming them. But others say it was fear. Because identifying those bones would have meant proving something the state didn't want in the archives. That this wasn't an isolated horror. That inbreeding wasn't rare in those forgotten corners of America. It was quiet, it was invisible, it was part of the fabric. When you look close enough at history, you stop seeing lines between normal and unthinkable. You start to see cycles. Isolation begets dependence. Dependence begets secrecy. Secrecy breeds sickness, not just of the body, but of the spirit, and that sickness doesn't always stay buried. There are whispers, even now, that a few descendants of the Bell bloodline changed their names, moved into towns, married outside, blended in, but the traits remained heterochromia, mild deformities, a tendency toward isolation, a distrust of outsiders. No one talks about it openly, but some old families in central West Virginia still avoid saying the name Bell. They call it the hollow curse. I spoke once with a man who claimed his grandmother had known them. He said she warned him never to take the mountain road alone. They listen, she told him, they hear through the ground. He laughed as he said it, but there was something behind his eyes, a flicker of belief he couldn't quite bury. Maybe he was right. Maybe some echoes don't fade. Maybe when blood folds in on itself enough times, it remembers. Because what we call horror was once just routine. What we call taboo was once survival. The line between love and lunacy is thinner than we want to admit. And when you read Ada's words, when you see how she tried to turn sin into scripture, you realize how easy it is to lose your footing in that dark. In the end, this isn't a story about one woman or one family. It's a story about isolation, about what happens when a community becomes a mirror, reflecting only itself, generation after generation, until the reflection fractures. The Bell House is gone, the cemetery overgrown, the valley reclaimed by vines and silence. But sometimes after a hard rain, people say you can still see a shimmer of light in the clearing where it once stood. Like candlelight behind invisible walls, maybe it's nothing, maybe it's everything, because if you believe, even for a moment, that memory has weight, then the bells are still there, not ghosts, not monsters. Just echoes of a choice too heavy to die. And when the night falls over Hickory Hollow, and the wind brushes through the trees like a sigh, listen closely. Some say you can still hear a woman's voice whispering the same words etched beneath that photograph, the ones that outlived her, her nephew, and every generation that followed. For love and blood are one.